Okay, now it's time to finish with the configuration scenario. We have finished configuring the VPCs, the subnets, EC2 instances, and the gateway load balancer. Now we need to configure the gateway load balancer endpoint, update the routes, and we'll be ready to test. So, let's get started. Okay, here is the gateway load balancer that we created earlier, and as you can see, it is in active status. Let's also verify the target group. And here in the Targets tab, we see the network appliance in healthy status. Now, let's create the gateway load balancer endpoint. To do this, we must go to the VPC panel. Now, before creating the gateway load balancer endpoint, we must create an endpoint service. An endpoint services allows you to make your service available to other AWS and VPC accounts. In our case, we are extending the gateway load balancer to another VPC in the same account. The gateway load balancer is in the security VPC and the application server is in the application VPC. Endpoint services, therefore, are commonly used by service providers to extend their services, such as network monitoring and inspection, to their customers. Now, this extension is possible through an AWS service called Private Link. Private Link allows you to connect privately to the target VPC instead of sending traffic over the public internet. So, once we create the endpoint and pass traffic to it, it will not go over the public internet, but over a private link. So, with this in mind, let's move on to create such an endpoint. For that, we just go into Endpoint Services and then Create. I'll give it a name like GWLB Endpoint Service. The load balancer type is Gateway, and from here, we select the Gateway Load Balancer created. Here, we can see the availability zones included. In our case, we are only working with a single availability zone. Below, we uncheck the checkbox for acceptance required. This setting is useful for service providers, as they can make their customers accept the connection. Next, from the supported IP address types, select IPv4, and then Create Service. Once created, we copy the name of the service as we will need it when creating the endpoint. So, let's go to Endpoint, Create. I'll call it GWLB Endpoint. From the service category, we select Other Endpoint Services. Paste down here the name of the service we copied earlier and click on Verify Service. Excellent! The service name has been verified. The next step is to select a VPC. In this case, Application VPC, since we want the Gateway Load Balancer endpoint to be created in this VPC. We select the availability zone, USC2A, and the subnet, in this case, Endpoint Subnet. The IP address type is IPv4, and then we create the endpoint. Now, this may take a few minutes to complete, so while that's happening, let's go back to the configuration scenario and quickly review the routing. Then, the application's subnet must have a default route to send all traffic to the Gateway Load Balancer endpoint. We need to create an edge association for the internet gateway of the application's VPC that will allow it to send all incoming traffic destined for the application server to the Gateway Load Balancer endpoint. This is not shown in the diagram. Now, the endpoint does not need a route to send traffic to the load balancer because it is an extension of a load balancer. The gateway load balancer and the network appliance do not need routing configuration because the appliance is a registered target. The endpoint needs a default route pointing to the internet gateway to send response traffic to the internet, and the Bastion subnets need a route so we can connect to them from the internet. So, let's go back to the AWS console and configure the required routing tables. Okay, back here, we go into Route Table. By default, you will see 3 routing tables, one for each VPC and the other, the AWS default for this region which I have given a name to identify it. So, Let's create the necessary routing tables. This routing table is for the application server subnet, so I will call it application subnet RD. I select the application VPC and create the routing table. Now, we must associate it with the required subnets. For that, we go to Subnet Associations. Edit Subnet Associations. This routing table is for the application server, and we save the changes. Next, we need to update the route. In the route stad, there is a default route for local VPC traffic, and this route is present in all routing tables. So, to add a new route, we click Edit Routes, Add Route. The destination of this route must be 0.0/0 by gateway load balancer endpoint. And we save the changes. Now, let's create the next routing table, which is for the endpoint subnet, and it will be called Endpoint Subnet RD. It will be for the application VPC, and we create the routing table. Then, we go to Subnet Associations, Edit, choose Endpoint Subnet, and save the changes. Once this is done, we go to Routes, Edit, Add Route. The destination must be all, that is, this IP, and the target of the endpoint subnet will be by the Internet Gateway. And save the changes. This route will allow the endpoint to send traffic to the Internet, but also we must tell the Internet Gateway that if there is incoming traffic to the application server, it must be sent to the gateway load balancer endpoint. For this purpose, we do not need a new routing table. We can simply edit the default routing table created by AWS for the application VPC, and we can see it here. Here, we can see that this is the default route created by AWS for the application's VPC. We can use this routing table to create the edge association. Then, with that route selected, we go to Edge Associations, Edit, select the Internet Gateway, and save the changes. So, with this configuration, this routing table will use the Internet Gateway to make a decision about incoming traffic. Finally, we will need to add a route pointing to the gateway load balancer endpoint. To do that, we'll go to Routes, edit the route, and we'll add a route for traffic destined for the application server subnet. In this case, it's 10.0.1.0/24. Then, when there is incoming traffic destined to the application server subnet, we want to send that traffic to the gateway load balancer endpoint. And with that, we save the changes. And finally, we need to create the routing tables for the Bastion hosts. These Bastion hosts are the ones that we will use to connect to both the application server and the network appliance. So, let's create the routing table. And this will be called Application Bastion RD. We select the application VPC, and we create the routing table. We go to Subnet Associations, choose Application Bastion Subnet, and save. Then, we go to Routes, Edit, and we will add a route for all the traffic through the Internet Gateway. And save the changes. This route will allow the Bastion host to receive and send traffic to and from the Internet. Finally, we create the last routing table, and this will be called Security Bastion RT. Select Security VPC and create the routing table. Next, we go to Subnet Associations, choose Security Bastion Subnet, and save. Then, we go to Routes, Edit, and we will add a route for all the traffic through the Internet Gateway. And save the changes. Then, with all this, we are ready to test our scenario, and we will do that in the next class. See you next time.